Were you living a wealthy lifestyle?
I just don't know what you mean by wealthy.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This episode is titled By Hook or by Crook. What do we mean by that? It means by any possible means, and the interesting thing about that is the example used in the Oxford Dictionary version is the government intends by hook or by crook to hold on to the land. In other words, by any means whatsoever. And so what do you think I'm trying to angle at in terms of this story about Maggies Millions? What do you think I'm trying to say? By hook or by crook, where did Maggies Millions go? It's a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. It's also an allegory for where Alex Murdaugh's millions have gone as well. Let me say that again. We can solve the riddle of the Murdaugh millions by following Maggie's money train into the station. And what you're about to see is that we follow the money train. When we do follow it, it's not so mysterious a journey as we thought. But then along the way, something mysterious happens. Another figure arises, Russell Lafitte, and we need to look into him as well. Russell Lafitte was convicted of helping Murdaugh steal as well. We will talk about him later. The straightforward answer to where Maggie's millions went is that she left her property in a will to her husband, and her husband later murdered her, right? We know that. If Murdaugh had gotten away with Maggie's murder, he would have automatically inherited all her assets. And since he didn't get away with the murder, what happened? Well, the irony is that Alex Murdaugh did ultimately, and I think initially, inherit Moselle, which belonged to Maggie, but only because he gave it to Maggie. And this is the legal sleight of hand that's easy to miss. Giving someone something while ensuring it's going to revert back to you. And it feels like Randolph's death, that's Alex's father's death, and the fact that he was dying in mid-June meant that certain contractual roles and reversals needed to be nailed down in order for assets to move and flow in a particular way, in the right direction. If this seems a little confusing and vague, I'll provide more specificity in a moment. What we're about to talk about is somewhat complicated, so if you've got a notebook, you might want to jot down a couple of notes, and you're certainly going to need to concentrate because this is a fairly intricate orchestration, right? So according to the Greenville News dated February 2022, right, in other words, more than a year ago, quote, in December 2016, Murdaugh transferred ownership of the Moselle estate to his wife Maggie. That's according to Tinsley, right, the lawyer representing Mallory Beach. And so he obviously is interested in that. It's thanks to him that we know this. And then following her death in 2021, ownership was transferred back to Murdaugh, right? Back to Alex in her will. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Palmetto State Bank, which has become, according to the article, entangled in the Murdaugh crime saga after he allegedly used one of their banks to conduct his illegal transactions. They hold roughly $2 million in a mortgage lien on the property. That's also according to Tinsley. And we get this information via another lawyer who's trying to get money out of this family. Now, the interesting thing with Maggie's money is that while the Mallory Beach attorney targeted the estate, targeted Moselle, Alex's brother John was acting as the executor. And so it was John, right? John Murdaugh, who put the 1,772 plus acre Moselle property up for sale for $3.9 million under the obscure listing Cross Swamp Farm, right? Moselle up for sale under the name Cross Swamp Farm. That was in February 2022, half a year after Maggie's murder. But before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed. If you don't know me, I'm a true crime author of I'm an author of over 100 books, many of them on true crime. If you're interested in looking at my Amazon author page, I'll put a link in the description. I've covered many high-profile cases, intricate high-profile cases, complicated high-profile cases, and a very important part of these cases is the financial narrative. And, I've covered that in the John Benet Ramsey case, in the Madeleine McCann case, is a very important aspect. Also the Scott Peterson case. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, check out my Amazon author page. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So if we return to this article in the Greenville News, as I say, dated February 2022. I'll put a link to it in the description. It refers to this farm, Cross Swamp Farm, which is actually Moselle, going up for sale in February 2022, half a year after Maggie's murder. And then the article continues noting, quote, as the number of civil suits against Murdaugh grow, Tinsley and the attorneys for other alleged victims followed up their suits by filing lease pendens notices. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but a lease pendens is an official notice to the public that a lawsuit involving a claim on a property has been filed, and a judgment or settlement could involve either the title to the property or claimed ownership interest in it. And what this does is it also puts further restrictions on the sale of any of Murdaugh's assets. But why would Tinsley want to do that?
Now, why would he want to do that?
So when Tinsley, the attorney representing Mallory Beach, was asked, why do you want to do this? He responded saying, the lease pendants gets filed because I'm trying to keep Buster and Alex from pulling some shenanigans. We are trying to keep them from wasting the assets or hiding the assets. Right? There's your answer. So you can see that Tinsley has followed the train to the station, and the way the money train potentially makes its way home is either through Alex or through Buster. Do you see that? Or to Alex via Buster. Now, if this is true, one can certainly see an incentive for Buster to want to stay in the family loop and in Dad's good graces. According to the article, quote, after alleged evidence surfaced that Murdaugh and his son, that's Buster, might be moving Murdaugh's assets around or spending them wastefully, Tinsley filed the injunction seeking the court-appointed receivership on October 22nd, 2021. Now, what do you think that involved, this idea of how could they be apparently spending wastefully? Well, Tinsley actually took a photo or found a photo of John Marvin and Buster at a Las Vegas casino. And so in the actual filing, he includes a photo that he says shows Buster and John gambling in Vegas, and he included exhibits of evidence that showed bills of sale for other Murdaugh assets. So it appeared that Buster and John were trying to dispose of property, including a boat and the ownership of a hunting club. Now, we don't know for sure if Tinsley was on the right track to be suspicious of Buster and his uncle, that's Alex's brother, but in theory, the Murdaughs could have claimed later on. So if someone wasn't sort of like a bloodhound following their every move and sort of sniffing where they were and what they were doing, so if someone wasn't doing that, in theory, the Murdaughs could have claimed later on that they'd frittered away all their money gambling. That could be one excuse. We were in Vegas and we lost everything. The article goes on to note that he was led, that Tinsley was led or misled to believe that the property would go on sale in February, right? That's Moselle, aka Cross Swamp Farm. But then as early as January, it appeared certain private buyers or insiders already seemed to know the property was for sale and they were making offers. So Tinsley kind of got this impression that there's a possibility that shenanigans are taking place and he's trying to make sure that they don't take place. So then for about a year, Moselle, aka Moselle Farm, languished in a sort of legal limbo as the Murdaughs and a growing list of creditors bickered over how the prized property should be divvied up. Remember, it's worth quite a lot, almost $4 million. Both sides insisted on getting their piece, an appropriate sized piece of the Moselle pie. According to the Daily Mail, quote, immediately after the property was put up for sale in February 2022, Murdaugh filed a qualified disclaimer with the probate court in which he renounced his inheritance. That's Alex. He files a qualified disclaimer. Well, what's that? Well, it means that if the property was sold, if Moselle was sold, any proceeds, any profits would not flow to him, it would not go to him, nor to the pockets of all those with claims against him, but to his surviving son, Buster, right? 26-year-old Buster. So think about what we're talking about. Murdaugh actually owns this property. Alex Murdaugh is gotten it from his wife, he's inherited it. And now what he does is he files a qualified disclaimer, which means the money isn't going to come to him, because if it did come to him, it would immediately be taken away through the lawsuits that are pending against him. And so instead of doing that, he redirects it to somebody else against whom there isn't necessarily a claim, and that's then the legal question. It's now been redirected to someone else. Well, can these creditors claim against that somebody else? And guess what the answer is? Now, on the other hand, you might think that what a wonderful, kind and honest gesture from Alex Murdaugh. You know, I don't want to inherit in these circumstances where I am accused of my wife's murder. And so how good of him to renounce his inheritance, you might say, because post-verdict, we can clearly see how this now feels. It feels like blood money, doesn't it? And you might think, it's actually kind of a good gesture. He's actually quite a good guy. Well, except the reality was that by diverting it to Buster, Alex's creditors couldn't touch it. So it's more sleight of hand, I think, than it is a good deed or a kind gesture. So do you see what we're talking about is a clever orchestration intended to dodge losing substantial chunks of change, substantial amounts of money to folks that Murdaugh owed money to. Going back to the article from the Daily Mail, quote, the complex legal battle over who was entitled to the proceeds stalled that sale, that's of Moselle, for close to a year. In filings and counter-filings, Marvin and Murdaugh petitioned for the right to sell. They were trying to insist. They were trying to push the right to sell. They were trying to rush it. While the receivers argued that neither Maggie's ownership nor the Murdaugh's renunciation of his inheritance were legal. So while Marvin and Alex were trying to sort of sell this property, you had others arguing that it was actually illegal, that it wasn't right, that it was actually a cynical ruse to hold on to the millions. It was just really another form of fraud. That was kind of their argument. And do you think they were right? Now, who would understand this fairly niche, complex, and intricate financial chess game, because that's really what it is, better than personal injury lawyers? If you didn't know about this kind of specialized area of law and people were just trying to sell a property, you might just shrug your shoulders and say, well, do whatever. And so it took other lawyers who knew about this to sort of get onto the scent of what was really going on. And so the Mail goes on to note, quote, key among those staking a claim to the money were several families of victims of the now infamous boat crash, end quote. Now the trouble was, although Buster seemed to be an sort of quote unquote innocent Murdaugh in this financial conflagration, he had actually provided his brother Paul with his ID, that led to Paul getting drunk, which played a major role in what happened after that. And so that was a really interesting argument that put Buster under a kind of legal cosh as well. Do you see how that mechanism sort of works? So then going back to the article, it notes the following. An offer of $3.9 million, just under $4 million, was accepted on Moselle in December 2022 when the sale was allowed on condition that the proceeds be held in trust until their division be decided in court. So after a year of bickering, they basically agreed amongst themselves that the way to deal with this that's going to satisfy everyone is that, okay, well, we'll put the proceeds into a trust. And so the article notes, the fate of Maggies Millions, which remained in limbo since her death, was finally settled last month when the Daily Mail can reveal the Gordian knot, very well expressed in this article. I'll put a link to it in the description, of claimants. A Gordian knot of claimants was unraveled. And then finally, some, clear financial information came to light. And here are a couple of instances of that, all highlighted by the Daily Mail. So the first is that after a protracted legal battle, almost $300,000 of the estate would be eaten up by lawyers' fees. It's quite a lot. Then a reduced mortgage settlement was reached with Palmetto State Bank, which I think the mortgage owed was over $1 million. And so I think over $250,000 was held towards that. So it would be a reduced mortgage settlement, around about a quarter of what was actually owed, a little more than a quarter, $275,000. And then Buster, this is quite interesting, Buster would get over $500,000, $530,000. And that sum was, in the words of the Daily Mail, augmented by his uncle John Marvin, his decision to waive the percentage that he could have claimed as a representative. Instead of John taking some of that money, as lawyers' fees or whatever, he allowed Buster to inherit the maximum. But then John was reimbursed an amount of over $12,000, not a lot, but nevertheless, Maggie's money, essentially, $12,305.28 for his personal expenses for personal funds advanced on behalf of the estate. Now, a good question is whether Buster's fragmented inheritance, right, whether a big piece of Maggie's Moselle was actually used to pay for his father's expensive defense in the recent double murder trial. In other words, whether Maggie's money was actually used to pay to defend Alex Murdaugh against charges that he'd murdered Maggie, and that Maggie's actually picking up the check for Murdaugh's defense. I'm just asking the question. I wonder what did ultimately pay for that. In the Daily Mail article, it's also a really interesting article. It notes that although Alex Murdaugh vocally remained focused on clearing Paul's name, and I mean that is some of the posturing that we see so evidently with members of the Murdaugh family, but especially Alex, while he was trying to apparently clear Paul's name in terms of the boating incident, right? In that context, you have Buster simply using the sale of Moselle to settle his suits with all the boat crash victims. He sort of quietly does that, and he's not trying to clear Paul's name, he's simply trying to settle those debts. And one of them was with Connor Cook. Connor placed a 911 call the day of the boat crash, and he told officers that Paul had been driving. He was also asked not to tell or to admit that he'd been driving. He was actually requested that. In any event, Connor received $100,000. And then the article goes on to say, quote, the balance of the proceeds will be divided between Morgan Doughty, Miley Altman, and the Beach family, with the Beaches understood to be receiving approximately $600,000 to release their claim against Buster. So remember, it was originally a $30 million lawsuit, and now it's kind of, certainly in terms of the Beach family, came all the way down to 600,000, and pretty much all of that money came from the sale of Moselle, because they weren't able to get hold of any other money. The article concludes that the settlement will be executed on March 8th, when the sale of Moselle is completed and the battle for Maggies Millions finally laid to rest. End quote. So I see we passed the 20-minute mark in this video. There's quite a lot to digest, but I'm really only halfway through my financial analysis. I actually did study law at university. I actually also studied economics. And so I do want to continue with the financial narrative. The last thing I want to say in this video is you might imagine that the mystery of Maggies Millions has now been settled, and I suppose it has. But here's the rub. The same train route that Maggies Millions ultimately took is the route Alex's father's money took, Randolph's estate, and I would submit also Alex Murdaugh's. Does that make sense? If you're not sure exactly what I'm angling at, I'll provide some more clarity on that in the next video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.